History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the most haunting rhyme in the Chronicle of Nations is the sound of an empire's death rattle disguised as the thunder of progress. There exists a pattern, ancient, immutable, merciless. An empire, wounded and humiliated, faces the abyss. Its treasury bleeds. Its enemies circle. Its people whisper of weakness. And in that moment of maximum vulnerability, its leaders make a choice that seems bold but is actually desperate. They gamble everything on a single transformative project, a great leap forward that will either restore their glory or accelerate their demise. The gamble always follows the same formula: promise the impossible. Mobilize national pride. Attract speculative capital with dreams of limitless returns. Build at breakneck speed, cutting every corner, ignoring every warning. And then, when reality collides with ambition, watch as the entire edifice collapses, taking with it not just fortunes, but the legitimacy of the state itself. Tonight, we examine 3 moments when great powers stood at this precipice and jumped. Our journey begins in the frozen wastes of Siberia in 1891, where a disgraced engineer named Dmitry Volkov proposed to save the Russian Empire with steel rails and phantom gold. We then travel to Weimar Germany, where similar desperation would fuel an industrial miracle that ended in ashes. And finally, we'll look at how the Soviet Union's own Siberian obsession became a slow-motion catastrophe that helped bring down a superpower. The chessboard is set. The pieces are moving. And the game, as always, is zero-sum. The year is 1891. The Russian Empire sprawls across 11 time zones, from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. On paper, it is a colossus. In reality, it is a wounded giant stumbling through the dark. The Crimean War has exposed Russia's technological backwardness to the world. While Britain and France deploy rifled artillery and steamships, Russian soldiers march into battle with smoothbore muskets and wooden wagons. The defeat is not just military, it is psychological, a shattering of imperial confidence. In the decades that followed, Russia has embarked on desperate modernization. Serfdom has been abolished. Railways have begun to creep across the European portion of the empire. But progress is agonizingly slow, and the great powers of Europe, Prussia, Austria, Britain, watch with barely concealed contempt. Now, a new threat emerges from the east. The great game between Russia and Britain for control of Central Asia intensifies. British India's sphere of influence creeps northward. More ominously, a newly modernized Japan begins to cast hungry eyes toward Korea and Manchuria, territories Russia considers within its sphere of influence. The strategic nightmare is clear: Russia's vast Asian territories are connected to the European heartland by nothing more than primitive tracks and frozen rivers. Moving troops from Moscow to Vladivostok takes months. The empire's eastern flank is defenseless, vulnerable, a gaping wound waiting for a predator's teeth. The solution, everyone agrees, is a great railway, a steel artery pumping Russian power across the continent. The Trans-Siberian Railway. But there is one small problem: Russia is broke. The treasury, drained by military adventures and palace extravagance, cannot fund such an undertaking. The state's credit is exhausted. Foreign investors are wary. The project seems impossible. And then, from the frozen exile of eastern Siberia, comes a letter that will change everything. Dmitry Volkov was once the rising star of Russian engineering, brilliant, charismatic, and dangerously outspoken. His crime was not incompetence but insubordination. He had publicly criticized the Minister of Finance for wasting millions on a failed canal project. For this act of truth-telling, he was stripped of his position and exiled to Siberia to contemplate his errors. But exile, intended as punishment, became laboratory. In the harsh Siberian wilderness, Volkov studied, experimented, and innovated. He developed new techniques for rapid rail construction in extreme climates. He created a revolutionary steel alloy that remained flexible in sub-zero temperatures. And most importantly, he formulated a plan. His letter to Tsar Alexander III is a masterpiece of persuasion. It begins with flattery, acknowledging the empire's greatness. It then pivots to fear, painting a vivid picture of British and Japanese encirclement. And finally, it offers salvation. Volkov claims he can build a strategic branch line to the mythical Golden Mountains of the Amur region in 3 years, 1/3 the time and half the cost of government estimates. But the truly revolutionary element is not the engineering, it is the financing. Volkov proposes creating Russia's first major public joint stock company, the Amur-Pacific Company. Rather than relying on the empty state treasury, they will tap into the vast reserves of private capital, merchant wealth, gentry fortunes, even peasant savings. They will sell shares to the public, promising not just patriotic glory but staggering financial returns. The bait? Gold. Volkov's geological reports claim that the Amur region contains vast untapped gold deposits. The railway will not just move troops, it will unlock unimaginable mineral wealth. Investors will become rich beyond their wildest dreams while saving the empire. The Tsar, desperate for solutions, summons Volkov from exile. The engineer presents his case with evangelical fervor. The railway will be more than infrastructure, it will be Russia's economic rebirth, its answer to American railroads and British steamships. It will prove that Russia can innovate, that it can compete, that the empire's best days are ahead, not behind. The Tsar, against the advice of his conservative ministers, gives his blessing. The Amur-Pacific Company is born. The share offering is a sensation. In St. Petersburg, Moscow, and even provincial towns, Russians of all classes line up to buy stock. Aristocrats invest their estates. Merchants pledge their warehouses. Even Orthodox monasteries pour in donations, seeing the railway as God's will for Russian greatness. Within months, the Amur-Pacific Company has raised more capital than any private venture in Russian history. Volkov becomes a national hero, feted in salons, praised in newspapers. He is the man who will save Russia. But inside the machine, rot spreads from the beginning. The Minister of Finance, Count Sergei Witt's predecessor, sees Volkov as a dangerous precedent. A public company, answerable to shareholders rather than the state, threatens the government's monopoly on strategic projects. He begins a quiet campaign of sabotage, delaying permits, questioning Volkov's credentials, spreading rumors about the engineer's radical sympathies. Meanwhile, General Konstantin Orlov, the man who originally had Volkov exiled, is appointed military overseer of the project. His hatred of the engineer burns with the intensity of wounded pride. Orlov uses his position to systematically obstruct construction, requisitioning supplies for military exercises, redirecting labor crews, and filing endless reports claiming technical violations. And then there is the British agent. Under the cover of a Swedish geologist named Ericsson, British intelligence has infiltrated the operation. His mission: determine whether the gold deposits are real or a massive fraud that could destabilize Russia's economy. Construction begins with great fanfare. Thousands of workers pour into Siberia. Rails are laid at unprecedented speed during the brief summer months. Volkov's method seemed to work. Steel stretches across the wilderness like a promise made manifest. But when the first Siberian winter arrives with its 40 below fury, the promise shatters. Volkov's revolutionary steel alloy, brilliant in theory, becomes brittle in practice. Rails crack. Bridges buckle. His rapid laying technique, which relied on shortcuts and minimal preparation, proves catastrophically inadequate. Entire sections of track simply collapse or warp beyond use. As workers freeze to death and construction grinds to a halt, Ericsson completes his analysis of the geological reports. His conclusion is damning: the Golden Mountains are a fantasy. The ore samples Volkov presented were either misidentified or deliberately doctored. There is no gold, only frozen rock and empty dreams. Eriksson, working through intermediaries, leaks his findings to the conservative Minister of Finance. The minister, seeing his chance to destroy both Volkov and the dangerous precedent of public companies, goes public. In a devastating report read before the Imperial Council, he declares the Amur-Pacific Company a gigantic fraud built on false geological data and impossible engineering promises. The effect is instantaneous and catastrophic. The St. Petersburg Stock Exchange erupts in panic. Share prices collapse. Investors, realizing they have been duped, rush to sell. But there are no buyers, only desperate people holding worthless paper. Thousands are ruined overnight. Aristocratic families lose ancestral estates. Merchants declare bankruptcy. The modest savings of clerks and shopkeepers evaporate. The human cost is staggering: suicides, broken families, shattered lives. The political consequences are even worse. The failure of the Amur-Pacific Company becomes a symbol of imperial incompetence and corruption. Radical pamphleteers seize on it as proof that the system is broken, that the Tsar and his ministers are either fools or thieves. The incident becomes one of many threads that, woven together, will form the noose of revolution. As for Dmitry Volkov, he stands in his St. Petersburg apartment, a wanted man. He has two choices before him: flee to Europe with the remnants of embezzled funds and live in comfortable exile, or face trial, knowing that his conviction is certain and that he will be made the scapegoat for a national catastrophe. In his hand, he holds two tickets, one to Berlin, one to Siberia for trial. Outside, an angry mob gathers, chanting for his blood. History does not record which ticket he used. Perhaps that's fitting. In the grand sweep of events, individuals matter less than the forces they unleash. The Siberian Railway would eventually be built, decades later, by the state using forced labor and vast subsidies. But the dream of private capital saving the empire had died in the frozen wastes, along with thousands of fortunes and, some would argue, the last vestiges of faith in the imperial system itself. Fast forward 30 years. The scene shifts from frozen Siberia to the industrial heartland of Central Europe. Germany, 1923. The once mighty Second Reich lies shattered, dismembered by the Treaty of Versailles. The empire that challenged Britain for global supremacy, that built the world's most sophisticated industrial base, that fielded armies of unmatched efficiency, this empire has been reduced to a republic struggling for survival. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial crown jewel, is occupied by French troops extracting reparations. Hyperinflation has destroyed the currency, a loaf of bread costs billions of marks. Middle-class savings vanish. Society fractures. But from this chaos emerges a different kind of gamble, not a single railway project, but an entire economic philosophy, the Mefo bill scheme and rearmament through creative financing. When the National Socialists take power in 1933, they inherit an economy in ruins. Unemployment exceeds 6 million. Industrial production has collapsed. Germany's military has been reduced to a token force. The new regime faces an impossible challenge: how to rebuild national power without money and under the watchful eyes of former enemies. The solution is a masterpiece of financial engineering, or, more accurately, financial alchemy. The regime creates a shadow currency called Mefo bills, essentially government IOUs disguised as private commercial paper. These bills are accepted by German businesses as payment for military contracts, with the promise of future redemption from the Reichsbank. It is, in essence, creating money from nothing, backed not by gold reserves or productive capacity, but by national will and the promise of future conquest. The Mefo scheme unleashes a wave of construction unprecedented in peacetime history. Factories rise from empty fields. The Autobahn network spreads like a circulatory system across the country. Most importantly, military production accelerates from zero to war-making capacity in just 6 years. The economic statistics are staggering. Unemployment plummets from 6 million to virtually zero. Industrial production triples. To the outside world, particularly to foreign investors and observers, it appears to be an economic miracle, proof that decisive leadership and nationalist fervor can overcome any obstacle. But beneath the surface, the machine is devouring itself. The Mefo bills create a hidden inflation bomb. By 1939, Germany has issued nearly 12 billion Reichsmarks in these phantom instruments, debt that can never realistically be repaid through normal economic activity. The regime's own economists warn that the system is unsustainable. The bills will come due. When they do, the choice will be stark: allow hyperinflation to return and destroy the economy, or find another way to pay. The other way means war and conquest, seizing the resources and wealth of neighboring countries to cover the debts created by the military buildup. In other words, the economic system requires territorial expansion to avoid collapse. The Wehrmacht doesn't march east because of ideology alone, it marches because the alternative is economic implosion. The rest, as they say, is history written in ash and blood. The gamble fails spectacularly. The conquered territories cannot produce enough wealth to sustain the war machine. The Soviet Union's resources prove difficult to extract under combat conditions. Allied bombing destroys the industrial capacity the system was supposed to protect. By 1945, the miracle economy has devoured itself completely. Germany's cities are rubble. Its population is starving. The financial instruments that seemed so clever in 1933, the Mefo bills, the forced loans, the confiscated wealth, are revealed as nothing more than elaborate Ponzi schemes that required ever-expanding conquest to function. The parallel to our Siberian railway is clear: a wounded power, desperate to restore greatness, embraces a revolutionary financing scheme that promises the impossible. Initial success breeds overconfidence. The project expands beyond sustainable limits. And when reality intrudes, when the gold doesn't exist, when the conquered territories can't pay for the war, the entire structure collapses with catastrophic consequences. But Germany, at least, had enemies to blame and a divided occupation that allowed for eventual recovery. Our next example had no such luxury. The Soviet Union, from its birth in revolution to its death in economic exhaustion, was obsessed with Siberia. This vast territory represented everything the Communist Party promised: untapped wealth that, properly exploited, would prove socialism's superiority over capitalism. The Gulag system, the Virgin Lands campaign, the Brezhnev-era BAM railway, each represented massive investments of capital and lives in extracting Siberian resources. And each, in its way, repeated the pattern we've seen: overconfident planning, brutal execution, and returns that never materialized as promised. The Baikal-Amur main line, begun in the 1970s, is particularly instructive. Brezhnev's regime, facing economic stagnation and American competition, bet heavily on Siberian development. The BAM would unlock massive mineral deposits, create new industrial centers, and prove Soviet engineering superiority. The cost was astronomical: billions of rubles that could have been spent modernizing Western Soviet industry or improving consumer goods. The railway was built through permafrost, across seismically active zones, in conditions that destroyed equipment and killed workers. When completed in 1984, the BAM connected almost nothing to nowhere. The promised mineral deposits were inaccessible or uneconomical to extract. The settlements built along the route remained tiny and dependent on subsidies. The entire project generated a fraction of the economic returns predicted. More importantly, it represented a broader Soviet failure: the belief that willpower and central planning could overcome economic reality. The USSR spent its final decades pushing resources into Siberia, building prestige projects, maintaining an empire it couldn't afford, all while its core industrial base decayed and its consumer economy stagnated. The pattern held: initial optimism, mobilization of national resources, cutting corners to meet deadlines, and eventual revelation that the whole enterprise was built on flawed assumptions and wishful thinking. Let us now step back and see the pattern clearly illuminated by three cases separated by decades and ideologies but united by a single, iron law of imperial decline. The cycle is this: crisis, desperation, revolutionary project, financial alchemy, initial success, overextension, collapse. A great power, wounded and facing competitors, seeks salvation in a transformative megaproject. Unable to finance it conventionally, it turns to creative mechanisms, public stock offerings, shadow currencies, centralized mobilization. Early results seem to validate the approach. Critics are silenced. Resources pour in. But the project is built on flawed foundations: phantom gold, unpayable debts, uneconomic resource extraction. When reality asserts itself, the financial instruments become worthless, the megaproject fails, and the political legitimacy of the regime suffers irreparable damage. Now, turn the mirror toward our present moment. Consider the United States, the current global hegemon, facing its own moment of relative decline. Its infrastructure crumbles. Its manufacturing base has been hollowed out. Its rivals, China, primarily, grow stronger. Its treasury drowns in debt. And how does America respond? With massive stimulus packages, quantitative easing that creates money from nothing, and ambitious infrastructure plans that promise to restore greatness. The Belt and Road Initiative from China mirrors this, a vast gamble on infrastructure creating its own economic returns. Or consider China's ghost cities and high-speed rail networks to nowhere, built at breakneck speed using debt-financed construction, creating initial growth statistics that mask underlying economic fragility. The question is not whether these projects will succeed or fail, that's too simplistic. The question is whether we recognize the pattern. Whether we understand that when empires gamble everything on revolutionary projects financed through creative means, history suggests the odds are not in their favor. Dmitry Volkov's ghost still walks the frozen rails of Siberia, a reminder that human ambition, however noble, cannot escape the iron laws of economics and physics. The Mefo bills are long since burned, but the lesson remains: you cannot conjure prosperity from nothing, no matter how clever the financial engineering. And the Soviet-Siberian developments lie rusting in the permafrost, monuments to the belief that willpower alone can overcome economic reality. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And we would do well to listen for that rhyme in the sound of bulldozers building our own impossible dreams, in the rustle of financial instruments too complex to be honest, in the speeches promising that this time, finally, we've solved the unsolvable. The pattern is clear. The cycle is eternal. The only question is whether we, standing here in our own moment of imperial twilight, will recognize the Siberian mirage for what it is before we too gamble everything on phantom gold and revolutionary steel. The chessboard is set. The pieces are moving. And history, patient and merciless, watches and waits.